It is my great pleasure to be here, and both in Sri Lanka and to speak to the SSA. I'm glad you mentioned Kanishka Jayasuriya, my former PhD supervisor, or one of my former PhD supervisors, because I was going to mention him. So I've always had this kind of long-term interest in Sri Lanka, and in recent years I've been able to put it into some practice, especially maybe unfortunately for Sri Lanka because of the way in which its financing from especially Chinese policy banks has played out. My interest in Sri Lanka emerged initially out of my concern and Lee's concern to push back on the so-called debt trap diplomacy thesis, which was the one that was largely used in order to describe the way in which China has engaged in Sri Lanka. So we found that particular argument to be far from convincing for lack of evidence, and we wrote about that. And then moved on from there to talk about more recent events, which is what I'm going to be discussing here today. So firstly, just to kind of give you a little bit of a context of where this is at. So this paper has been accepted by the Review of International Political Economy, an academic journal, and it will come out, I think, hopefully, very, very soon, because we've done the page proofs. So if anyone is interested, I'll be more than happy to share the paper. It's already been accepted. But I still am very interested in your feedback because it's part of a larger ongoing project, so I can certainly learn from that. And as is often the case, I've done it with my so-called academic spouse, Lee Jones, with whom I've worked on a lot of different books and articles. So essentially, this project takes off where the previous work that we've done ended, which was basically to look at Chinese development financing. We've written about the Belt and Road Initiative, not just in Sri Lanka, but more generally. And as we know, at some point, due to a variety of factors that we can talk about, many countries ended up with a debt pile that they struggled to repay, entered into debt distress. And at that point, the world again kind of revisited the mechanisms for addressing sovereign debt problems, which were sort of developed in the 1980s in the previous major debt crisis that happened, the so-called Third World Debt Crisis. But the difference between then and now is that now China has become a very significant provider of development financing to many countries, and it was not part of the arrangement that was developed initially in the 1980s and in the 1990s. So this is just a map that was produced by the Debt Justice NGO, a website that documents the extent of debt distress the countries have found themselves in. And as you can see, many countries are in the red, which means that they are already in a debt crisis. The IMF estimates that many, many more could enter into a debt crisis in the coming years. We've had a bit of a quiet year or two when it comes to sovereign debt problems, but I suspect that it's the calm before the storm of another wave of potential defaults and debt distress in many developing countries. And as I mentioned to you, and this is just to show you some visuals, China has become a major contributor to many of these countries. And while it is only one of several providers of development financing, it is still a very significant provider of development financing, bigger than any other bilateral provider, and for a limited time, it was also providing more development financing than the World Bank. But that was almost 10 years ago, that period now. As you can see also, almost the biggest increase that has occurred in that period is in sovereign bonds, in Euro bonds, international sovereign bonds, something that is often not discussed very much, but hopefully we can discuss that a bit today. So, one of the issues that have emerged in recent times as countries have found themselves again in sovereign debt distress and attempted to restructure their debt in some way. And it's funny for me to talk to this audience here because generally I tell the story in other countries, often in Australia. People have no idea at all whatsoever about sovereign debt problems, how to restructure them and so on. Unfortunately, in Sri Lanka, everyone's an expert. So you're going to have to bear with me. If this is really boring, just tell me to skip, just do this, and I'll keep going. So essentially, debt restructuring have become really, really slow. And some scholars have argued that the result of that increasing slowness is the increasing participation of China as a major lender to developing countries. So let's take the case of Zambia, one of the more significant instances of debt default in Africa. So Zambia defaulted on external debt, meaning debt to external creditors, not just China, all sorts, in November 2020. Finally it signed an agreement with its official creditors, meaning the government that lended money in June 2023. And that entailed extending the maturity of the debt and lower interest rates. And then it reached some kind of an agreement with bondholders in October 2023. So this is 3 years, effectively, of being in sovereign debt default. And then the official creditors determined that the agreement was too generous, and they went back to the private creditors. And again, after much toing and froing, a final agreement was signed, and Zambia was able to restructure its debt. So it took a very long time for this to occur. A recent paper that I'm citing here from International Studies Quarterly, published by Ferry and Zeitz, basically tries to quantitatively demonstrate that in instances where China is involved as part of the creditor group, the restructuring takes longer. So the more China was lending, the longer the restructuring was taking, and they measured that via IMF visits to these countries. So there were more IMF visits required, International Monetary Fund visits required when China was a bigger creditor, and they found some kind of quantitative connection between the two. So this is part of a broader argument that has emerged, which argues that what is causing that slowness in debt restructuring is the presence of China as a major creditor. And that connects to an even broader argument than that, which is that China is using the debt crisis to contest US hegemony as part of its broader contestation of US hegemony in a variety of different areas. So now it's also contesting US hegemony in debt restructuring. And that effectively China is undermining the existing system, the existing arrangements in global governance for addressing sovereign debt. So basically, what I'm going to talk about today is in front of you there. So what I'm going to talk through first is the argument that China is undermining existing global governance arrangements for addressing sovereign debt. And one example for that is China's increasing role as an international lender of last resort, contesting the IMF. And a second point of evidence for that is that China is also contesting the IMF's norms for sovereign debt restructuring, known as the Debt Sustainability Analysis, DSA. The third one is that China is also refusing to join the Paris Club of official creditors and also rejecting their norms. And key among these norms is the norm of comparability of treatment. So all creditors are meant to be treated the same, and there is evidence to show that China is not playing that game. But I'm also going to be providing some conflicting evidence, and that evidence shows that China has also participated in G20, Group of 20 initiatives with the Paris Club, and that China, in fact, ironically, has insisted on comparability of treatment among creditors more than any of the so-called members of the Paris Club, the so-called traditional donors and so on. So in fact, it's keener on that norm than even they are. Additionally, China has offered no real alternative to the institutions and the norms that are propagated via the IMF by the traditional powers, and also that its behavior is inconsistent with what you may describe if you were taking the quote-unquote realist approach in international relations to China's strategic interests. And then I'm going to explain this discrepancy, these two things, by going to the approach that Lee and I developed in our book, Fractured China. Thank you, it's a very clever pun. And in the book, Fractured China, we talk about how China is not a monolithic actor. In fact, it's made up of a lot of different agencies, sometimes with conflicting interests. And more of these agencies have attained access to international politics. And because of that, Chinese behavior internationally is not always consistent, not always strategic. In some cases, it's downright contradictory. So the argument that we're making here in this paper, based on that framework, is that actually the way that China engages in sovereign debt restructuring has been largely shaped by the interests and outlooks of its policy banks, which are its main international lenders. Their outlook is relatively narrow, and consequently, Chinese behavior is not following any kind of strategic template that people may have expected. So just look at that, because that's basically what we'll be talking about in however long I've got. Right, So again, this is not really for the Sri Lankans in the room, which is almost everybody, but this is my really badly drawn effort to try and explain how sovereign debt restructuring, in a sense, is supposed to work. So this process was established bit by bit in the 1980s through the debt crisis. And I'll just kind of walk you through the steps here. So the first thing is we have a debt-distressed government. That debt-distressed government is going to the IMF. That's number one. It says, help, we can't repay our external debt, or we think we will not be able to repay our external debt soon. And then what the IMF does, it basically tries to investigate whether that problem is short-term illiquidity, in which case it might offer some kind of short-term loan and then everything will be fine. That can happen. During the COVID pandemic, the IMF provided dozens of these. Or the problem is a deeper problem of quote-unquote insolvency, meaning that the country is structurally incapable of paying its external debt. And then the IMF basically conducts what they call a DSA. Well, in that process, it will determine that, but it conducts a deeper DSA, debt sustainability analysis. This is number 2. And in the debt sustainability analysis, it basically puts forward what needs to happen in its view, in the view of its staff, in order for a country to become no longer insolvent. So that involves both changes to a country's fiscal position, different things. It could be cutting spending, could be all sorts of stuff. And also, sometimes, often, the debt restructuring that is required from the country's creditors. And then, the debt-distressed government starts to talk directly to the creditors. Now, historically, most of its official creditors, meaning the governments that were lending money to it, were engaged in a thing called the Paris Club, which is the informal club of these creditor countries. The Paris Club negotiates together. So all of them sit together in Paris, presumably in a very nice room, eating nice food, and they meet the representative of the government, and they work out their collective arrangement, what they're willing to do. And that is meant to set the signal also for the private creditors, because most countries also have private creditors, which historically used to be banks lending. These days, usually bonds. Okay, so that's steps 3 and 4. Now, everyone has to basically agree on what the IMF is saying. If everyone agrees, then the IMF releases its funding, and then everyone else follow through on what they agreed to do. That's basically how the process is meant to work. Now, just to not kind of bore you too much with the detail, but of course not everyone agrees. It's, what economists would call a collective action problem. If one agrees to, to take a bigger haircut, to forfeit more of their returns, and someone else can be paid more. So this is why everyone is trying to coordinate, especially via the IMF and the Paris Club. But essentially, the IMF also has the capacity to lend into arrears, as they call it, meaning to put pressure on creditors that are not playing along by giving more credit to that government, but we'll leave that for now. Now, what's really important here is that the Paris Club negotiates collectively, that the multilateral development banks and the IMF are excluded. They're not restructured, even if the debt to them is very, very big. And that the Paris Club is the mechanism for what you may call comparable treatment. So through the Paris Club, every creditor is meant to be treated equally relative to their exposure. So if you lent a lot, you'll be cutting more, but everyone needs to cut roughly the same. So that's the fairy tale story of how these things are meant to work, right? Okay, so now we go into China's challenge, right? That's the left-hand column on my slide. So the first challenge that China supposedly provides to this arrangement is its increasing provision of loans as international lender of last resort. So the reason why this mechanism works, why countries can be pushed into doing certain things sometimes when they don't want to, is because they usually have no other choice. If they need to, if they want to avoid default or to come back from default, the IMF's resources are pretty much the only one they have available. This is why they call the international lender of last resort. And the IMF, as I mentioned, requires certain conditions. Some people call it conditionalities, which is a bit of an ugly word. I don't know where it came from. Someone can tell me. It demands conditions in return for its money. So it makes countries do certain things. I'm sure people here have heard about these programs in order to meet the requirement of the lending. So what's happened in recent years is that China has increasingly come to be providing also various loans that have been described as international lender of last resort loans. And they come in three forms. The first one is central bank swaps. That's mainly for swapping renminbi, the Chinese currency, with the currency of the particular country, but it's also a loan which countries need to be paying back. Again, this is something that Sri Lankans are somewhat familiar with because Sri Lanka, like many other countries, has that agreement with the People's Bank of China. The second one is called bridge loans, which are more like the old school bank loans that banks used to give countries. And they look a little bit like IMF loans. They're provided usually by the China Development Bank. And these are just international loans that these countries are meant to be paying back. These are typically US dollar loans, okay? So they are more immediately comparable to the IMF. And the final one, which is a relatively small one, is advance payments for commodity exports. So if you look on the right-hand side, you would see that emergency lending, this kind of lending, has increasingly become a very significant part of what China is lending internationally. It started from insignificant levels in around 2010 to reach nearly 60% of what China was lending overall by 2021. So this is the vast majority of lending that quote-unquote China is doing right now is that kind of lending, is emergency lending. However, the overall quantum has declined dramatically as well. So while they're doing mostly emergency lending, they're just lending a lot less in general. So this is an argument that people made, that China is producing a challenge for the IMF because it's lending, but without the same conditions. But there are big limits to that. There are big limits to China's challenge to the IMF. And the first one is that it has provided a very, very small amount by comparison to the IMF. And in many cases, it has been insufficient to stave off default. And I'll get to that point in a little bit again. Excuse me. The second challenge is the IMF's norms and its, if you like, theory of debt restructuring, how the IMF understands what needs to happen. So Chinese officials have long contested the IMF's take on sovereign debt. And they said that the IMF doesn't distinguish sufficiently between different forms of external borrowing, between borrowing for consumption and borrowing for infrastructure, for instance, which can improve the productivity of an economy and generate future growth. So this is going back a long time. This is a story that has not really changed. Even as late as 2019, there was an IMF paper that was, not an IMF, sorry, an MOF, Ministry of Finance, of China paper released about China's approach to sovereign debt. And even then, this is before the debt crisis really took off, they were saying, well, you know, the IMF might think it's too much debt, but this is good because it's the kind of debt that contributes to the productivity of an economy. So again, you know, as before, there are big limits to the challenge that China is imposing here. One of them is that China has not really offered any alternative to the IMF's analysis of a country's sovereign debt. Basically, all it asks for is that the IMF is more transparent about how it arrives at different calculations, and that creditors should be also allowed to make their own calculations next to the IMF's calculation. But it never really tried to create a new system that would actually mobilize other creditors around a new way of understanding how sovereign debt should be restructured. And the final challenge is that China has refused to join this club, the Paris Club of official creditors. It's not that it wasn't offered, and it came pretty close to joining in 2016, but it never joined. And the argument that's often been made, and in fact, some Chinese officials have even said that, is that China rejects this collective principle, the principle that you negotiate collectively, all the creditors together, and also that the debt restructure needs to be comparable, that all of the creditors should have comparable haircuts when the time comes. And in fact, research that's been produced by researchers in the United States, led by Anna Gelpern, have found that a lot of, I don't know how they got these contracts, but they got 100 Chinese lending contracts, and they found that China often has secretive clauses, meaning that countries that are borrowing from China are not really allowed to negotiate, that they would negotiate first with China. They're not allowed to default on one Chinese loan, because if they default on one Chinese loan, that is the equivalent of defaulting on all loans. And collectively, this was seen, again, as a very strong pushback against the norms of the Paris Club. which is historically the home of the creditor countries through which the process works. But here's the thing, and this is where we start to get a little bit into the contravening the evidence that I can show you that pushes back a little bit on these three kind of arguments regarding China's challenge. The first one is that actually China has cooperated with these official creditors, and it has cooperated, I think, quite significantly through the G20's agenda, the so-called DSSI, which is the Debt Service Suspension Initiative of 2020, where the G20 came together and said, basically, because of the COVID pandemic, we need to find a way to reduce the immediate debt burden for different countries. So official creditors were asked to hold back on repayments, to reschedule. Some of them did that. Other providers, private providers, did not participate in this whatsoever. And we can see through this table here that was put together by Deborah Browdingham and Yufan Huang, that China has contributed the largest share of debt. It's not restructuring, it's rescheduling, postponement, suspension, if you like. China has suspended 63% of the total. So clearly, Chinese banks have engaged with this quite seriously. So that's one piece of evidence. The second one is that China has also become involved in the so-called common framework for debt treatments beyond the DSSI, which is the framework that the G20 developed beyond that initial arrangement. And this arrangement was meant to entail also kind of serious restructuring, not just rescheduling as the DSSI. So China has been a part of that, but the thing is only 4 countries have so far negotiated under the terms of the common framework. And these countries are Chad, which ended up not restructuring at all, and that's a whole other story, not going to get into. Zambia, which I mentioned before, which took a long time. Ghana, which has already restructured its debt, but China is not actually a major lender to Ghana. It's mostly sovereign bonds in Ghana. And Ethiopia, which is kind of in the late stages now. But again, it's taken quite a long time to get there. So basically what we can see is that in this case, and certainly when we come to these restructuring processes, China has provided a challenge and potentially has slowed things down somewhat. But the slowness of negotiations was not only China's fault. And in fact, there have been a lot of arguments and negotiations relating to comparability of treatment, with China insisting that private creditors, especially bonds, actually pay their way and contribute as much restructuring as the official creditors. And arguably, this is the first time, even though the Paris Club has been established on the principle of comparable treatments, maybe the first time that they've actually enacted it in some cases, albeit private creditors still usually get a slightly better deal. But if you look historically, private creditors typically got much better deal than official creditors, and they had to cut a lot less. So arguably, as I said, China could be more committed to comparable treatment than the Paris Club. Much has been written about this, and again, like a lot of what China does, the immediate thought was that this was that China's challenge to the IMF and China's challenge to the system for restructuring sovereign debt is part of its broader hegemonic geopolitical challenge, counter-hegemonic, I should say, to the United States. So this is something that we talk through the paper, and let me try and talk you through it as well. So there are 2 basic interpretations that one could marshal to see how debt restructuring could connect with China's approach to debt. The first one is the so-called debt trap diplomacy thesis, which, again, many people in Sri Lanka would be familiar with. And that is the argument that China is on purpose lending too much to countries to get them into too much debt and then use that in order to take over assets. And this is the story that's often been told about the port in the south of Sri Lanka, Chodor. That is not really what happened there, but that is a common story that's been told. If you think that that is true, your expectation then would be that now that a lot of countries are in debt crisis, boom, you spring the trap, right? You've got a debt trap, now's the time, you can do it. That has not really happened. I'll show you in a moment. The second one is that China would be disbursing loans for geopolitical purposes, and the aim here would be to cement good relations with countries by being really generous. So they are in debt trouble. China comes in as the knight in shiny armor, gives them money, gets them out of trouble, wins their support, and then can use that for geopolitical purposes as well. And again, that is not really what's happened. So the first one, the debt trap one, let me get through that really quickly because that one, really there's no evidence for it anyway, and there's no one single case that I'm aware of, people can correct me, of the debt trap being sprung anywhere in the world in the way that at least the debt trap diplomacy understands it would happen. So let's park that. Now, and I should also add that the debt trap thesis is all about China is springing the debt trap to collect strategic assets like the port of Hambantota, but actually what Chinese lenders have really done is collect cash collateral that they've often insisted on. In some cases, they had these escrow accounts held offshore that had some access to, and in those accounts, they made borrowers put some cash, and of course, they collected on that cash. So they're obviously trying to protect their bottom line. This is not unusual for a creditor, but they were not springing a debt trap. They're just collecting cash. They have no interest in collecting assets because if you collect an asset, you have to make it work. And we could see that with the port of Hambantota. The Chinese company, the state-owned enterprise that has taken Hambantota, has actually put a fair bit of effort into making it a successful port. So they don't want that, they want cash. Now, if we talk about China's supposed benevolence or the potential for China to act as a more benevolent provider of development financing to win supporters in the world, we haven't seen that either. So the first thing that I can tell you, and this is a list of all the countries, this is from that paper that was published that looks at China as international lender of last resort. And these are the 22 countries that have received quote unquote rescue loans from China over the last 20 odd years. So the ones that I've highlighted for your benefit are the countries that got some emergency lending from China and then had to go to the IMF anyway and got slapped pretty hard while doing so. And all of the big borrowers from China, all of them, all the big debtors are there. You've got Angola, you've got Argentina, you've got Ecuador, you've got Egypt, you've got Mongolia, you've got Pakistan, your neighbor, you've got Oman, you've got, unfortunately, Sri Lanka's there as well, you've got Suriname, you've got Ukraine. Venezuela really wanted to get support from the IMF, but of course, because the United States doesn't recognize the Maduro regime, couldn't get that. And then there's a couple of other countries in blue that got more short-term lending, but we'll park that for now. So clearly what that shows is that China has not really been able to, bail these countries out. I mean, they provided some emergency lending and then they end up going to the IMF anyway. And we know, for instance, from Pakistan, the deal they got is really, really bad. And China's often seen as that country's fair weather friend, but it has not bailed it to the extent, all weather, my mistake. All-weather friend, and it has not bailed it to the extent that would have been sufficient to avoid going to the IMF and doing what everyone has to do pretty much in these situations. Also, China has acted quite inflexibly in most of its debt restructuring negotiations. This is a story that we've seen here and we've seen in other countries in relative terms. And there have been some implications for that in terms of China's standing publicly. We've seen in Zambia that China's standing relative to the United States really collapsed as a result of its inflexible position in negotiation. So again, if you're arguing that China is doing this for some kind of public benefit, for gaining the support of these countries, it's hard to make that argument in this context. Now, very briefly, because this is where we are, and often when I give the talk, this is not the situation where I don't usually give this talk in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is another example for this because the conversation around the debt trap diplomacy thesis and the general borrowing, this is not the conversation in Sri Lanka, this is the conversation around the world about Sri Lanka, okay? I just want to make that clear, is that basically the regime in power here, the Rajapaksa family, were very close to China and China was there to support them and that it would bail them out when push came to shove. And of course, Sri Lanka entered into a debt problem. China actually stood aloof, provided very, very little support. India was the one that came in and provided a lot more support. And lots of people are saying that it gained geopolitically at China's expense as a result, although some people might say that more recently, India might have overplayed its hand a little bit in that. But nonetheless, again, a story that's been told through the lens of China's in it for some kind of geopolitical gains. falling off the cliffs of evidence. This is not really what happened in Sri Lanka. Right, so how do we explain this behavior that I've shown you that China has demonstrated in debt restructuring, this combination of both challenge to the existing system, but also cooperation with the existing system, of not really following through on what people expect it will do geopolitically to gain out of this debt crisis. So how do you square that circle? This is where the framework that Lee and I developed in Fractured China, as you can see, the pun also made it to the cover of the book. So the argument in the book, and this is the framework that we put into practice here, is that China is quote unquote fractured. And what we mean by that is that there is this idea of China, certainly there is this idea in many circles of Western policymaking that I've spoken to, is that China operates a little bit like the villain from a Bond movie sitting there stroking a white cat and then basically ordering all the minions to go and do things. Now, I will not be saying that China is not an authoritarian country. By all means it is. But that is not how the Chinese party state works. And in that book, we developed a framework for basically explaining how the Chinese state works and how it works internationally, right? So we're not really interested in particular in the domestic aspects of this, but more in the international aspects of this. So what we're basically arguing in the book is that China operates as a kind of what we call Chinese-style regulatory state. And that has resulted from decades of transformation of the Chinese party state through its globalization, right? Because China, we know, has become very deeply integrated globally. And we follow through three processes. I'm going to skip through this very fast. I'm happy to take it up in the Q&A, but I don't want to waste too much of your time. So basically, it has fragmented, meaning that a lot of different agencies are now doing roughly the same roles. It has decentralized, meaning that a lot of functions, especially economic functions, are taken up by provincial and lower level governments quite directly. And it has also unevenly internationalized. What we mean by that is that agencies, both national and local level agencies of different kinds, that previously were only focused domestically, have come to acquire an interest and a capacity to act internationally over the last, say, 20 or 30 years. And the argument we make in the book is that because these are not often particularly well coordinated, and in fact, in many cases, they have downright conflicting interests, what we see as a result is Chinese behavior internationally that is often uncoordinated, incoherent, sometimes contradictory. Not always, but that is often part of the picture. We also in the book talk about the way in which this is coordinated, and I think that's important for the story of debt restructuring. So you have some coordinated mechanism. This is not a free-for-all. This is not like, we're not saying there's anarchy in the Chinese party state, to paraphrase the Sex Pistols. It's actually a system, like I said, that operates as a kind of regulatory state. So the regulatory state is a political science concept that has been used quite widely in the West, not often used in the Chinese context. And in the West, it talks about the reforms that have occurred largely through neoliberalism, where government has taken more of an indirect relationship to governing. So instead of having a kind of hierarchical relationship between top of government and the agencies tasked with implementing what government wants, it increasingly operates at arm's length through market, through other forms of more indirect governance, right? So we talk about a Chinese-style regulatory state. It's not the West, but there is a kind of regulatory state that's emerged in China. And there are coordinated mechanisms that the leadership can deploy in order to try and cohere this wide expanse of many, many actors across many levels in a direction that it roughly wants them to travel. The first one is, of course, ideology, just whatever ideological pronouncements are coming from the top. The second one are formal policy frameworks and slogans. You might have heard of the Belt and Road Initiative. Well, that's an example for that. There are also leading small groups, LSGs as they call them, in the party and the state, and also party commissions that try to cohere how different agencies work in particular areas. So there might be a leading small group for the Belt and Road and similar agencies, leading small groups emerging elsewhere. There's also the discretionary control that sometimes central agencies and elites have over fiscal policy and legal concessions, and in many cases those below them need that, so they need to at least appear to be doing what the leadership wants them to do. And then probably the most important part of this is the party itself and the mechanism that it has to discipline and appoint and reward cadres. So the party itself obviously is a very powerful coordinating mechanism, because if the power of the party decides to go after somebody, they are generally in real trouble. And that is a mechanism that often is deployed to cohere the Chinese party state. But the subordinates are not necessarily kind of passive recipients of this. They do what we call the 3 I's. They either try to influence national policy in different ways, various forms of lobbying and agitating in different ways. They also sometimes, and this is probably the most important one, interpret the policy pronouncements that come from the top, because a lot of the policy pronouncements that come from the top are quite vague, not very detailed. This is pretty much always the case, and that leaves considerable scope for those below to actually interpret these things. And they always say they always say that they do things to do whatever the leaders wanted, but in many cases they do completely different things, right? So that's the role of interpretation. And finally, there is ignoring. They can try and ignore. That, is a recipe for a short life, but it can happen, and it happens often. It's well documented. But the most important one is interpreting. That's the one that, gets a lot of work here.
Yeah. Can you just give us an illustration of this? Is there any way you can unpack it a bit? Because I feel this is
all right. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So let's take the Belt and Road Initiative for a second. I mean, the Belt and Road Initiative is a good example. The unpacking, by the way, comes next, because then I'll be explaining how it happens in debt restructuring. Would that be okay?
Yes.
Because that's a demonstration of this. So bear with me. I know it's a little bit of running through quite a lot of stuff, but now I'll be demonstrating that in detail to show you how the particular nature of the governance systems within China for managing both development financing but also the restructuring of debt have created the response that I was describing before. So if that's okay with everyone, I'll just do that. So the argument we're making there is that basically this is not like, because there is the school of bureaucratic politics. I don't know if people here are students of political science, or I'm sure many of you are, so there's work on bureaucratic politics. And the argument in the literature on bureaucratic politics generally assume that there's like a moment of decision. So they talk about arguments, they talk about argy-bargy, as we say in Australia, and then there's a decision, and then that's what happens, right? So they see the fragmentation up to the moment of decision, and then it goes on. That's not what we talk about. We talk about ongoing, never-ending, ceaseless struggles across the entire process and with feedback loops, right? So this is an ongoing thing. Now, let's demonstrate that in relation to the governance of China's development cooperation. So what you see here is a diagram that we created to basically describe China's development finance cooperation governance. As you can see, it's already quite complicated, right? There's a lot of different agencies involved, and that already begins to give you a bit of a sense of what I was talking about. So, on the left-hand side, you've got the agencies that are responsible for what you may call Chinese aid. Not development financing, not sovereign loans of the kind that we've largely talked about, but aid. China also provides aid, right? Chinese aid doesn't look exactly like traditional aid from traditional donors. And the definitions are different because China doesn't work by the international definitions of the OECD, but it does give a fair bit of aid. But when it comes to aid, China is not like a mega influential, important player. It's roughly comparable to the kind of aid levels that many Western countries provide, okay? So on that left-hand side, if I might actually just stand up just to demonstrate. So there's a line going roughly through here. All of these are aid agencies. There is a new agency created here called the China International Development Cooperation Agency, CIDCA, and these agencies basically provide either grants, donations as you may call them, or interest-free or very, very concessional loans, but mostly interest-free loans. That is a very small part of what China provides. We're talking here only about around 10-12% of the total, okay? These ones, Chinese government is relatively happy to forgive, and it has done that in the past. When I'm saying relatively happy, I mean relatively. They're not happy to forgive them, but they have done so. Because these are fiscal contributions. They've already made the contribution. They are not happy, not too unhappy to lose them, right? that makes it more like Western aid, because Western aid generally comes in the form of grants or very concessional loans, and these are fiscal contributions made through the budgets of the governments of different countries. This is not really the main game. The main game is what's happening here. This is development financing, and this stuff is not concessional. The Export-Import Bank of China here is actually a little bit in the middle, because it provides a little bit of concessional, but mostly not concessional. So the main players here are Exim Bank and the China Development Bank. There are some regulatory bodies here I'm not going to get into too much right now. So the China Development Bank and Exim Bank, in the height of the Belt and Road, they're providing roughly 80% of China's international lending, right? So these are the players. So an issue that has been consistent in China's development finance governance systems, which Lee and I have written about in different papers, is that it's fragmented, it's very loosely coordinated, there's a lot of tail wagging the dog going on. So we have SOEs basically convincing governments to then request financing back from China. And the policy banks, and this is really important for our story, enjoy considerable leeway in how they lend and basically negotiate directly with governments of recipient countries. So let's look a little bit more in depth at China's fragmented approach to debt relief, which is the issue at hand. I already mentioned that it's a lot easier to forgive debt on the aid side. So all those zero interest and grants you don't need to forgive, but the zero interest loans, many of them have been forgiven. We have seen lots of examples of that. But the policy banks really don't like to forgive or seriously write down their lending to sovereign countries. The reason for that is that basically these are, although they are state-owned, they are still profit-seeking. They're self-financing, so they don't get fiscal contributions from the Chinese Ministry of Finance in order to run themselves. The way that they finance themselves is really good work by Muyang Chen, who's a Chinese academic from Beidai, Peking University, has written about this in detail if people want to follow that through. They release bonds that have sovereign-like rating, and these bonds are purchased by largely China's state-owned commercial banks, which are, obviously part of the Chinese state-owned financial system, but they're commercial banks. And that provides them with the capital that they need. So that's basically a system whereby Chinese households are forced to save largely in those state-owned commercial banks at not great rates, and then those funds are mobilized in the form of bond purchasing to provide financing, and then the policy banks can mobilize that financing to support largely the state-owned sector. So that's basically how that system works. But they're highly reluctant to take losses on their commercial loans, which, like I said, is almost everything that they provide. Firstly, there is no system currently in China for writing down bad foreign loans. Everything has to be done on a case-by-case basis, and it has to be done via appeals to the State Council directly about particular loans, and that is considered career suicide. No one wants to do that. And the State Council is also unlikely to approve major write-downs for for the debt of other countries when China itself has a massive internal debt problem, which we can talk about later on. But of course, part of the issue is that because they finance themselves through the bonds that they issue that have sovereign-like rating, if they were to write down vast amounts of debt that are held by countries outside of, by other countries, that could ultimately, in a very unlikely but potentially devastating scenario, also impact their bonds, which, like I said, have sovereign grading within China. So they basically would do almost anything to seriously cut down debt. They don't mind rescheduling. They do all sorts of things. Very rarely they might cut interest rates. They don't like to do that either. But basically what they prefer to do is reschedule and hope for the best. That's kind of where they are at the moment. Now, going back to how the Chinese party state works, this is almost the end, by the way, in case people are wondering, when is this going to end? So essentially, things move a little bit more coherently when you have very clear directions from the top. But that is not common in China. Most directions from the top in China are somewhat cryptic, and in many cases, they are a little bit contradictory. In many cases, they're lacking in detail. So no senior leader in China gave a very clear steer for the policy banks about the direction they're supposed to be going with debt restructuring. Xi Jinping basically said something along the lines of debt should be taken on a case-by-case basis. And then other times he basically said, well, China has done really well with debt suspension during the COVID pandemic. I hope that everyone else does the same. That's pretty much the extent of what he said about this. And that leaves an enormous amount of scope for others to interpret, as I said, how things are going to work in practice. Additionally, in China, the agencies that have a wider diplomatic outlook are relatively weak within the Chinese system, especially in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which has a wider kind of geopolitical take on things and maybe would be inclined, we know from the work that people like Deborah Bradigan have done, that they have lobbied for more generous responses from Chinese policy banks to other countries' debt problems, but they don't have the power to force them to do it. They can kind of cajole them, they can try and encourage them, but they can't force them to do it, and they generally don't do it. There are a number of regulatory agencies that maybe would have some capacity to force policy banks to do things that they may not want to do, but they have competing interests. So the People's Bank of China, which is a pretty important one, although now it's stepped back a little bit. So People's Bank of China also has a direct stake in the policy banks. It is actually a share owner in those banks through a variety of different arms, and therefore it does not have any real stake in seeing these banks take massive losses on their balance sheets. And partly, maybe that explains its willingness to lend through currency swaps, which is the main way in which China has tried to bail out other countries. But of course, the renminbi lends, the People's Bank of China lends in renminbi, and the renminbi is not a very useful currency to get support. It's more useful to get it in the form of US dollars, which they could do via the State Administration of Foreign Exchange, SAFE, but they wouldn't. They don't do that. So basically, what we have, because of this fundamentally fragmented system, where the steers from the top are very limited, where the agencies that that have a wider diplomatic outlook are very weak and have no capacity to compel the policy banks to do anything they don't want to do, and where the regulatory agencies have mixed interests and certainly an interest in avoiding big losses, what you have is the situation that I was describing, which is the policy banks have an enormous amount of leeway to engage internationally in ways directly, they're actually negotiating directly, in ways that serve their own interests, which are relatively narrow. And their interests are about not taking big losses on their international lending. Now, it is possible that increasingly they'll be forced into becoming more like others and take losses, and we have seen them being more willing increasingly to reduce interest rates because reality is starting to hit them in the face. I mean, there's only so much rescheduling you can do. There's massive debt piles out there. I believe that eventually they'll be forced into doing something more systematic, right? But this is an explanation for how we got to and where we are right now. So in another year or two or 3 or 5, maybe things will be a little bit different. But it won't be because they wanted to go there. It will be because they were sort of pushed in that direction, kicking and screaming because they cannot, there's just no way these countries can repay the debt. Right, so just to finish up, basically, just to kind of sum up, China is weakening existing arrangements in global governance of sovereign debt restructuring, but it's not providing a viable alternative to distressed countries either. So I guess ironically, you may say that if China had been a more strategic unitary actor in the way that a lot of people understand it to be, maybe the deal for these countries suffering debt distress would have been better, because they maybe would have done more for them than they have. But in reality, what they got was the policy banks trying to protect their own bottom line, which again is very normal behavior for a creditor. This is nothing new, going back to ancient times, right? Creditors want to get their money back, that's simple. So I'll end on this quote, which is where Lee and I kind of got to with our project, which is from a paper by McNally, who says, rather than an all-out great power competition, we are facing an increasing likelihood of the absence of great power coordination and leadership. And what happens is the countries in between are kind of just left to deal with that, and often not very well. Thank you.